Random thoughts. In this video, we are going to look at some of the documents that were generated by the CIA about Tom Mboya. They started talking about Tom Mboya in the 1950s, and seems like Tom Mboya became an individual who they saw had a lot of potential as a politician, especially going by how he carried himself and the things he was doing and what he had achieved in his very short life, or even at that time as a very young man. The first document I'm going to read is a document that was generated by the CIA, and all these documents I'm reading in this video are documents that were generated by the CIA, and they were declassified, some of them as very recent as 2020. The first document I'm going to read is a Central Intelligence Bulletin that was published on November 14th, 1959. This first document talks about the conflict that existed between Tom Mboya and Kwame Nkrumah. This is what the document says. Kenyan nationalist leader Tom Mboya's active participation in the regional labor conference being held this week in Lagos, Nigeria, under sponsorship of International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, has for the first time made public his clash with Ghana's Prime Minister Nkrumah. Nkrumah recently brought out Ghana's disaffiliation with ICFTU, and last week staged a rival labor gathering in Accra looking towards the formation of an independent African Trade Union Federation. A spokesman for Nkrumah released a statement on 10 November which called Mboya opportunistic and reactionary. The Accra meeting cited a Kenyan without trade union connection who was referred to Mboya as an imperialist stooge. Last December, Nkrumah was largely responsible for naming Mboya chairman of the A11 African People's Conference, AAPC, held in Accra, and the two men cooperated closely to keep the conference an essentially moderate course. Discord between the two leaders developed at least as early as last spring. Then there are sentences that have not been classified. Mboya complained vehemently to Nkrumah about Accra's tactics in connection with AAPC activities. Early this month, Mboya acknowledged privately that his relations with Nkrumah were cool. Mboya said he is unwilling to be manipulated by Nkrumah, who wants to achieve undisputed leadership of a Pan-African movement. Mboya also called recent Nkrumah initiatives affecting Liberia, Togo, and Guinea inept and arrogant, and indicated that both he and Tanganyikan nationalist leader Julius Nyerere strongly disapproved of such trends in Ghana as the subordination of trade unions to the government. So that document shows that there was a difference between Nkrumah and Tom Mboya. I don't know whether this was actually the case or it was manufactured. We never know for sure. But it seems like there was a difference. At least the CIA made a note saying that there was a difference between Tom Mboya and Nkrumah in 1959. Now, the second document I'm going to read is still another Central Intelligence Bulletin. This one was October 21st, 1959. And there is a section where the bulletin talks about Kenya again, and it also mentions Tom Mboya, and this is what it reads. The title, African Nationalists Demonstrate in Kenya. Tension continues high in Kenya, where police on 20th October broke up a demonstration by African nationalists for the release of convicted Mau leader Jomo Kenyatta. Earlier, African leader Tom Mboya had been forced to sign bond to keep the peace for 90 days, a move designed to block the demonstration, but one which had little effect. A major source of friction between the government and African nationalists is the government refusal to legalize Mboya's Kenya independence group on the grounds that it does not meet the requirement that all parties be multiracial. A second major issue is the government's 13th October proposal that the rich white highlands farm areas be opened to all races. The proposal has been attacked by Mboya as well as by the rightist settlers. Mboya apparently believes that the government had not gone far enough, and also may fear that the government intends to economic concessions to be substitute for political concessions to Africans. This is interesting. Seems like on October 13th, this is 1959, the government did give concessions, the British government, we can say the colonial government, to allow Africans to have the right that they could go and occupy the so-called White Highlands and maybe do farming, which in theory maybe it seemed like it was doable, but in practical, most likely not. Most Africans could not afford to buy land on those areas, and maybe there were other barriers. And Mboya looked at this concession as a tactic to make Africans celebrate that and forget that they needed to have political independence. The demonstration for Kenyatta appears to have been planned in the face of indication that it will lead to Mboya's physical arrest, and was probably directed less towards the release of Kenyatta than towards embarrassing the Kenya government. Mboya's leadership of the Kenyatta demonstration may enhance his prestige among Africans prior to the Constitutional Conference scheduled for early 1960, and offsets to some degree his involvement in fractionalism, which has lately plagued the African members of the Legislative Council. Yeah, so that is 1959. The detail that I had never known about is that there was this concession by the white government in Kenya to allow Africans to have a right to occupy the so-called White Highlands. Of course, we know that from early 1900s, the British government had basically made it law that the White Highlands could only be occupied by white settlers, and Africans who were found there were only there to provide labor to the farmers. The third document is another Central Intelligence Bulletin. This is published on 2nd March 1960. It also talks about so many other topics, but in there's a section where it talks about Kenya. The subtitle is Kenyan African Maintains Pressure for New Concessions. Statements by African delegates on their return to Kenya from constitutional talks in London have been provocative in tone and reflect intent to continue pressure for full independence. African leader Tom Mboya has characterized the compromise agreed to in London as only an interim measure to be followed swiftly by full independence. The London Agreement provided for legislative election later this year under greatly enlarged African franchise, which is expected to result in a legislature with African majority. A speech on 27 February by Mboya, in which he advised moderate as well as rightist Europeans to accept African-dominated democracy in Kenya or get out, was followed by disorders between African nationalists and police. A second African spokesman emphasized in a press conference that African delegates had not committed themselves to the preservation of the White Highlands, a rich farming area which remains European preserved despite action late in 1959 to legalize African holding. The prospect increased African participation in government, unabated African demands for full independence, and continuing pressure on the White Highlands, which will prompt some Europeans to leave Kenya and may lead to others to consider extra-legal means of combating African threat. Now, again, this document mentions this legalization or the law being changed to allow Africans to own land in the White Highlands. And yes, as we've seen, Tom Mboya didn't think that went far enough, and he wanted in full independence for Kenya. The next document is a document that was published or generated on 17 June 1963. This is a document that's all about Kenya, and at this time Kenya has gained internal, we can call independence. Jomo Kenyatta is the prime minister, and then Mboya and others form the cabinet. Now, I'm not going to read the entire document. I'm going to read sections that talk or say some interesting things about Mboya, but I'm going to read the first paragraph so that we have context. So the title of the document is Government of Kenya. On June 1st, 1963, following the victory of the Kenya African National Union, KANU, in the May elections, and the proclamation of a new constitution by Governor Malcolm MacDonald, the patriarch of Kenya nationalism and president of KANU, Jomo Kenyatta, became prime minister of one of the last major British areas in Africa to attain internal self-government. He will lead his country to complete independence, probably within 9 months. Selected for the first time completely from the party supported by Kenya's largest and most politically conscious tribes, the Kikuyu and the Luo together comprise about 30% of Kenya, 8.5 million Africans. The cabinet reflects the divided nature of KANU itself. Kenyatta has apportioned ministerial and sub-ministerial appointments to achieve a careful balance between the main and the lesser tribes groupings. The warring factions grouped around Tom Mboya and Oginga Odinga within KANU, and among the three racial segments of Kenya population: African, Asians, and white. One notable fact emerges from a study of the educational background of the cabinet. The only member who did not complete secondary school is the most able politician, Tom Mboya. So apparently Tom Mboya didn't complete secondary school, but this document describes him as the most able of all the people that Jomo Kenyatta appointed to become ministers in his first government, or the first government of independent Kenya. Another section of the document reads, the only politician who approaches the national stature of Prime Minister Jomo Kenyatta is Tom Mboya. Named Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs on 1st June 1963. Tough and resourceful, Mboya is General Secretary of Kenya National African Union and derives his strength from his faction in KANU and from Kenya's most powerful labor organization, the Kenya Federation of Labor. Mboya is probably the major threat to Kenyatta's leadership of KANU and the country, and their relationship is an alliance of convenience. Kenyatta needs Mboya's political brain and ability, while Mboya Aluo needs Kenyatta's prestige and support of the Kikuyu tribe. By far the ablest of Kenya's political figures, Mboya faces, however, the opposition of old guard nationalists who were jailed with Kenyatta, of the extremist anti-Western elements in Kenya, and of his personal enemies. They are sentences that were not classified. Consequently, although he might wish to tighten control of KANU, suffering under what he sees as Kenyatta's vacillatory leadership, he recognizes that such a move will provoke cries from his opponents that he was betraying the leadership of the popular old nationalist. Symbol of African nationalism to the West, he has become the symbol of Western influence to Africans. Born of Luo parents on 15th August 1930 on Rusinga Island, Lake Victoria, Mboya baptized into the Roman Catholic Church, Thomas Joseph Adhiambo. He was educated at Kakaba Mission, St. Mary, and Holy Ghost College Secondary School, withdrawing when his father would no longer afford to help with the tuition. Shortly afterwards, Mboya was accepted for training as a sanitary inspector. 3 years later, he took the Royal Sanitary Institute certificate and was appointed to the Nairobi City Council, where he served next 2.5 years. About 1951, he became president of the African Staff Association and built it up into the Kenya Local Government Workers Union, becoming its national general secretary. Mboya was treasurer of the Kenya African Union 1953, just before it was proscribed for its alleged connection with the Mau Mau. Later that year, he became secretary general of the KFL. In March 1957, he won the Nairobi seat in the first African constituency elections and proceeded to bind the 8 African elected members into a solid group strongly opposed to the Littleton Constitution under which they had been elected, and to demand that the British government declare Kenya an African country and advance gradually to full democracy. So that document talks some more about his life. Then we have this other document published in the 1960s. This document, the most interesting part I found is where he talks about his chance of taking over after Kenyatta. There's a paragraph that reads, articulate, brilliantly logical, and a master political tactician, Mboya is by far the most able and intelligent man in the Kenya cabinet. He is also the most controversial political personality in Kenya today. In the behind-the-scenes race already being run for the presidential successor to Jomo Kenyatta, Mboya suffers from the liabilities of being too young. He's 37, too westernized, and too detribalized. So this guy, we can say, was the first Kenyan politician whose base was not actually tribe, but ideology, we can say, or people who believed in what he stood for, and we can say, of course, mostly from the labor circles, the labor union circles. Although he has surrounded himself with bright, moderate politicians, civil servants who look to him for leadership and guidance, Mboya, the lines that have not been declassified, is vehemently opposed to the younger Kikuyu, not declassified. Their efforts to neutralize him have been a significant factor in recent Kenya internal politics. Kenyatta himself, there's a line not declassified yet, he is well aware of the skills and talent the minister brings to the government, and is not averse to having Mboya do work in parliament and elsewhere where intelligence and political skills are required. For a long time, Mboya was better known abroad than any other Kenyan politician. So yeah, talks about the brilliance of Tom Mboya and how he was best placed to become the next president of Kenya after Jomo Kenyatta. So there are so many documents that talk about Tom Mboya, and we can't go through all of them, but most of them basically portray him as a very able politician, very intelligent one, and a politician who stood above every other politician in Kenya. And at some point, it looked like obviously he was going to be the next president of Kenya. But of course, that did not happen in 1969. He was assassinated. And yeah, so we never got to see him become what many thought he was going to be. Those are my random thoughts.